This episode is brought to you by CarMax. Searching for your next car? Don't settle. Thrive. At CarMax, it's easy to shop online or in person. With upfront pricing and tools designed to help, finding a car you love has never been easier. Plus, you can sell or trade in your current vehicle with an online offer in minutes. No strings attached. Start shopping now to find a car you'll love at CarMax.com. CarMax, the way it should be.
Hey, we are back from our annual break. I had an absolutely fantastic month off, which even included 2 weeks of hiking around tiny towns and eating well in Italy. Since then, I've been thinking a lot about good food and nutrition, so maybe some of those ideas will end up in the show. So stay tuned. This is Hear Her Sports. I am your host, Elizabeth Emery. And now, you and I are back to it. It's a little weird to be back, but I am thrilled to be talking to wonderful women, editing those conversations so I hear them again and get to learn so much from my guests. The show is back to the regular schedule of posting full episodes every other week on Thursdays, so be sure to subscribe to stay up to date. I have a bunch of great interviews already lined up and even already recorded. You will want to hear them all. I hope you all have been doing well this past month and are enjoying fall and the WNBA playoffs and are getting ready for your winter sports. I think it would be great to get some good skiing snow this winter in Cleveland, but I'm not hopeful and I'm still playing squash, so we'll be fine with or without it. Squash does a terrific job keeping my spirits up during the short, very gray days of Cleveland. For me, staying active in winter is essential for my mental health. For anyone local, let me know if you want to get on the squash court. I'd love to show you the game. Okay, let's get to this week's episode. I am so happy to have Eurosport commentator Iris Slappendel here to talk about this year's Women's Tour de France. Iris raced professionally for 12 years. She retired in 2016 and shortly afterwards co-founded the Cyclist Alliance, an organization that supports women professional cyclists and campaigns to improve their working conditions. Iris remains the executive director, and through her work there is very much connected to the sport and with the riders. To learn more about the Cyclist Alliance, or TCA, and what they do, there are 2 episodes to check out. Back from 2018, in episode 42, Iris herself introduces TCA when it was just getting started. And then in 2020, in episode 88, I spoke to Rhianne Ravenscroft, the vice director of TCA, about their ongoing work. 2024 was the 3rd year of the current version of the Women's Tour de France. The main sponsor is Zwift, so the official name of the race is Le Tour de France Femmes avec Zwift, which you will hear everyone say in full, even though it always feels like a gigantic mouthful. I say the full name as well because I gotta give props to Zwift for jumping on the opportunity to sponsor the race in as big a way as they have done over the past 3 years. They continue to grow the race and support it intelligently. Getting involved with the tour wasn't completely a leap of faith, but they did certainly step up like no other sponsor had done. I hope they are reaping huge rewards, and I am more than happy to say avec Zwift. During the tour, Iris commentates from a motorbike and is an expert on the riders, the teams, politics, and race tactics. In the episode, she shares stories from the tour and what her days were like. We also talk about the fateful crash in Stage 5 when the GC leader and one of the race favorites, Demi Vollering, crashed with less than 7 kilometers to go and ended up racing to the finish all by herself. The tactical decisions by her team, SD Works, were odd at best. In the show notes, I've included a link to a short video analysis of what went on. Iris and I also talk about the length of this year's tour, 8 stages in 7 days, and what our hopes are for the future. I've already gone on record that I don't think 8 stages makes a grand tour, but Iris goes through some of the pros and cons of longer races, even for the men's side. And we hear about Iris's take on the current level of the women's peloton and where growth still needs to happen and how much development we've seen even in just the last 5 years. In the show notes, I've included some links about the history of the Women's Tour de France. There have been many versions over the years, including the one I did several times called La Grande Boucle. We don't talk about it, but Iris also has her own apparel brand, which she started after retiring as a pro. Her cycling jerseys, shorts, and everything she makes is really amazing looking and different from anything else available. She makes all the fit and fabric choices with women in mind, and it is all top notch. You can take a look at her latest line at i-ris.cc. Well, Iris Slappendel is always a delight and fun and zippy, so let's say hello and get started. Well, Iris, hello, welcome back. Thank you for being here. It is such a treat to talk to you again on the show. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, we're here to talk about the Tour de France Femmes avec Zwift because you have been very involved, connected to organizing from early in planning days to bring back the race. So I really want to ask, just like, tell me everything, but we would be here all day. You were so good. You were so good on the moto and during the pre and post race.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Well, this was a third year of the tour. And so, I'm thinking maybe instead of saying, tell me everything, I'll ask you, what was it like this year? How was it different from last year?
For me, the biggest difference really were the crowds, especially the first few days in the Netherlands. It was really incredible for me how many people showed up to cheer on the peloton, and we're so interested and engaged and in women's cycling. For me, that were the biggest crowds until now I've ever seen at a women's race, maybe next to a World Championships or Olympics. And that was super special. So,
do you know why that was?
Well, it was more in the Netherlands than in France. So I guess also the Dutchies really love women's cycling or cycling. And I also think in terms of organization, it's probably been really well communicated to like local authorities, to municipalities, to everyone that there was a race coming through, and people were aware and they came out of their houses during summer holidays to just cheer on. And so I think that's one reason. And I think also women's cycling is quite a big sport at the moment in the Netherlands. So we have some amazing cyclists that people now know really well. So I think they also love to come and cheer on Marianne Vos and Demi Vollering and all the others.
Yeah, you have some real superstars right now.
Yes, yeah. So I think that helps. Yeah.
Sure, of course. So, it's now been a few days where you can reflect on what happened. Do you have takeaways other than these big crowds, about the racing, your part in it?
Well, I've been mostly sleeping since I'm home because it was so exhausting. But I think also, of course, the finale, it's been so exciting that the race has been decided by only 4 seconds is something also extremely special. And
sure.
that it's been such a thriller until the very last day. I think that really helped also in viewership. I know in the Netherlands it's been really well watched on TV, also the last stage. So for me, that you see that in general the level of the peloton has been rising more and more, and you see that on the professionalism of the riders. They're getting more and more used to the media, but also just the depth of the field has really increased. And we've seen quite a number of different riders winning stages, and also a bit more surprising winners. And I think that's also shows the current level of the women's peloton is super high.
Yeah. Gosh, I have a ton of questions. I mean, one thing that I try not to do is to compare to the men's tour, because, there's so much that's different. It's not as long. The teams are not as big. And you mentioned the depth of field, but it's certainly not as deep as the men's field. Do you have any thoughts about that? And what would your goals be in terms of where the women's field is going to go?
Well, I think, yes, the field is not as deep, but that's also because the peloton is just smaller. Like there are less
Sure.
women racing than a man. And I think if you look to the last few Grand Tours of the men, that has been also pretty boring, with Pogacar just winning by a huge length, you know. So I think no matter how deep the field is, you will always have these exceptional talents that people love, but also in a way make racing a little bit more predictable. And maybe it doesn't mean it's less exciting, but it's, yeah, I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages of having these superstars in the sport. So yeah, I think in that way, women's cycling needs the time to grow and get that a bigger peloton, and therefore also a deeper field. But I think we already see that in the last few years that there is a development, and we see different riders winning. We see a lot of young riders now coming into the sport and doing already really well.
Amazing.
Yeah, like also in this race, Cédric Kerbao, who wins the stage, Puck Pieters, the competition for the young riders jersey. So there are a lot of young riders that come into the sport and do really well. But if I look at this from the perspective of being the president of the Cyclists Alliance, which my other hat to put on, then I do think that we need to be very careful about the development of the sport, and there has been so much focus on this top end, the top of the pyramid, and I'm like always repeating myself here a little bit, but I think it's great that we have a Tour de France Femmes, because it shows a new generation that the women can race on the highest level and that you can make a career out of professional cycling, but that pathway into professional cycling, into the top tier, that's not perfect at all yet. So I think that's something we should keep focusing on. And actually, as a Cyclist Alliance, we focus on it, but it's also important that our governing bodies and also race organizers don't forget about it.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that later, because you guys came out with a new survey, and so I want to talk about that later. But one of the things that I noticed in terms of, you're talking about sort of the progression of women's cycling, and it seems like the tactics change so much because sort of the makeup of the race, and as we're talking about sort of the field change. And one of the things this year, sort of everybody counted on there being huge gaps in the Alpe d'Huez, and that just didn't happen this time around, which is fascinating because, like, you can never count on what happened last time because women's racing is changing so much.
Exactly. And I think that has also to do with the depth within certain teams. So I think it's also a little bit maybe, yeah, the form or the shape of the day, or yeah, exactly, race tactics that come into play that some teams do well, that better than others. I think Lidl Trek is a good example of, especially that last day, without even actually riding for the win at the end, they had a huge influence on how the race developed, and Kasia Nimodoma eventually winning the Tour. So I think it's a good example that you see that the tactics on that very last day were super interesting. SD Works trying to race really smart with getting 4 riders in a breakaway. On the other hand, in the end, because they had 4 riders in the breakaway, they never were able to create a huge gap because the peloton didn't give that big gap. So it didn't play in their favor. It played in the favor of Lidl Trek, with having Lucinda Brandt still there on top of the Col du Glandon, so the second last climb. And therefore playing in the favor of Kasia Nimodoma, because she was then in a chasing group with 2 girls from the same team, Lidl Trek, not Kasia's teammates, but they were still wanting to keep that gap as close as possible to Demi Vollering, who was in front. Yeah, I don't know if this is clear for anyone who hasn't seen it, but I think it is. These tactics of course, are always part of cycling and women's cycling, but because we get more stronger teams that race smartly and also really race like it's also important to get a top 5, for example, in the Tour de France, or get a top 10, because the race is much more visible now. We see more of it on TV. We see longer, bigger parts of the race. We see more stages. It's also more visible for the fans, how tactics play out, and how teams are, how teams choose to, focus more on I don't know how to explain it exactly, but they're focusing more on the result.
Well, also which results? I mean, particularly in the Tour de France, there's so many different things that you can go for.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have the fact that some teams are focused more on stage wins, or like there was a big battle for the QM jersey, for example. And on the other hand, you have also, like I say, Little Trek. They just wanted to get the maximum out of it with Gaia Reolini on that last day. So they're also more willing to gamble. And I think it also has to do with not only we as fans see more of the race, but also the sport directors see more of the race. The races are longer, which also has quite a big influence on strategy. So I think, all these factors together, help the fact that it's strategically becoming more interesting also.
Yeah. It sounds like you think that the women's tactics are starting to get really good. I mean, is that true? Do you think it still needs to evolve? I mean, where are we?
Yeah, also here, I don't think it's necessary to compare to the men, because I think similarly, they also sometimes have tactics I don't understand. In the women's peloton, there's also sometimes tactics I don't understand. But it's also quite hard to judge it from the outside, because I know as a rider, you're fully suffering, full of adrenaline. You like, as a fan, or if you're as a viewer, actually, you have much more oversight of what's happening in the race than when you're on the bike, or when you're even in the team car. And there's always this delay also for sport directors, and before they get instructions to riders, etc. So I think it's sometimes easy for us to judge from the outside, like, oh, these tactics are not smart, or they are really smart, etc. It's very different when you're out there, when on your bike, full gas racing. But I think women's cycling has always been a bit more unpredictable, and that also has to do with, not necessarily because the tactics aren't so good, but it also has to do because the racing is shorter still. There is like we said before, the depth in the field is less. So therefore, teams sometimes underestimate other riders, or overestimate others. That all has to do with it.
So you mentioned how, like, we could be critical of tactics. I mean, there certainly was something that happened on stage 5 that there was some discussion about. Maybe it shouldn't have gone that way. And I'm certainly critical of what happened in many ways. Do you think that commentators are now willing to be critical enough of riders and teams in the women's racing? Because it seemed to me for so long, everybody wanted to be rainbows and unicorns about the women's racing, because they wanted to support it and they wanted to be positive and not have some sort of negative discussion. But I think in some ways that can be detrimental.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's definitely something you see, that commentators are more critical, and also, dare to be. I think it also has to do with, like, a sport that's growing, and also as commentators, they see more and more on TV. And I think also for the riders, it's good to understand that these critics is not something they always have to take personally, but it's also part of a sport to become more professional. Like, they all want to race on the highest level, they all want to have the Tour de France Femmes, they all want to have a big salary and a good prize pot. But on the other hand, it also means there is more media attention, and media attention is not always positive because we see everything that's happening now in the peloton. So I think it's also for the riders to learn that it's part of their job and it's part of a sport that's developing. And it's these stories actually that maybe make like if I now speak with friends about the Tour de France Femmes that happened and they're not completely into women cycling or cycling at all, they're like, oh wow, what happened at that crash, what happened there? Like they want to understand because people speak about it, media speaks about it. So of course it puts the SD Works team not in a great light. I don't know if that's an expression in English.
Yes.
But on the other end, people speak about it and they want to understand, and it actually creates from Demi Vollering, on the other hand, it kind of maybe it makes her even more likable than she was before, because she has to deal with these weird team tactics. So it has a lot of has a lot of angles, the fact that there is more media attention, and therefore there is there is a bigger light on what's happening.
That whole thing with Demi being left totally on her own after the crash was super interesting for me, just in terms of visuals. Like as you talked about, there was more media coverage, and so visually it just looks so terrible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you said, for like the casual fan, it's I would expect it was very difficult to understand.
Yeah. No, I think so too. And I mean, it was also quite terrible. Yeah, I also said that. I think it's, there's always, I think there's, on one hand, there's always mistakes to make. And this is a mistake that's been made. And I don't really understand how this could have happened, because your GC, especially if you already have the yellow jersey in the team, that should always be the number one priority. On the other hand, I think again that the team just did really bad with the communication afterwards. Like they could have also said, like, we made a mistake here, we didn't have the good overview, instead of like defending and saying, oh, it was nothing, it's not important, she's gonna win anyway with like a huge margin because we have the mountain stages and she's the best. I think that's another thing that it's very human to make mistakes, and there's for sure reasons why teammates didn't wait for her. But then sometimes it's also sometimes better to say, hey, we made a mistake, it shouldn't have happened, because I think that team now puts themselves quite in a bad spot by kind of an arrogant response almost, especially towards their competitors.
But I think that's sort of interesting, because one of the things that struck me is in the past, that team and Demi could be arrogant because they were the best. And clearly this version of the tour showed that things are progressing, things are changing, the peloton is changing, and that arrogance no longer serves them.
No, that's completely true. Yeah.
We've talked a lot about media. Like, where do you think we need to improve in terms of media?
Well, it would be great if we would have like full coverage of these kind of stages, of course. I think there's a huge improvement in media, and I think part of it is thanks to some broadcasters who have really invested in women's cycling, but also in the teams themselves. Some teams are super proactive in getting stories of riders out there. So I think that's been it's been very important. The biggest improvement is probably on all the other races, because women's cycling now becomes, which I was a bit afraid for 3 years ago, but it becomes this sport that is just evolving around the Tour de France like men's cycling is.
Right.
So I think it's really important that we create a narrative throughout the whole year, and there's other races that are really, really interesting and fun to watch, and that deserves the same kind of media attention. But it also has to do with the race calendar and make sure that the narrative is there and that it's something that everyone understands. So people, yeah, like I say, I have friends that just watch the tour because it's on TV, and it's easy to tune into. But that should be the same for the other races, because then they really get to know the peloton and and how women's cycling works.
I've been impressed with the commentators, although I will have to say I still think there's improvement with that group, just in terms of how much they know about the riders. And, as we get more hours of coverage of a race, there are, there's incredible downtime, and you have to fill that time. And I think in the women's racing, that time that's being filled is not being filled maybe in the best possible way.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I am one of these commentators. So,
well, you're very good. I can say you're very good. They should have more moto coverage.
But but that's true. I think it's also, to be honest, I find the same on the men's side, because there's also, and I think that's maybe something that I actually think women's cycling is doing quite well in, like, getting stories out there. But it's great to see, at least like during this tour, I listen to the English commentators when I'm on the moto, and I actually think they're quite well informed, not just about the top riders, but also the domestiques or the riders from the smaller teams, because that's actually quite interesting. Now we have longer coverage. You also start to see riders that are normally not winning races, but they are in early breakaways, etc. So they should be able to tell more about those riders also.
Yeah. And, I was wondering that, women's cycling just doesn't have the history that men's cycling does. So, like the male commentators can say, oh, like back in, whatever, 20 years ago, this and that happened. And, they can't do that in the women's racing.
It would be great to have now also more, and that's something at least I see with Eurosport Discovery, that they try to get as many, like, former pros in commentator positions. Like in France, they have Roxane Fournier, and Audrey Cardon is doing some work in that. In the UK, in the Netherlands, so in Germany they have Lisa Brennauer now. So I think this is really great, because these are also riders that are still so connected to the peloton, so they know small things or news, or all these things that are that you can only know when you're fresh out of racing, basically.
Right. And I love that they're getting work, like in their field of expertise, rather than, I don't know, fading away as they might have before. Yeah, it's great. Well, you were on the moto and you were doing all this other stuff for Eurosport. What was it like behind the scenes? Like, what were your days like? You mentioned that you were exhausted now.
Yeah, the days are pretty long, because we had quite a lot of transfers also from finish to start the next day. So normally because, for example, we had a double day on Tuesday. So that was a day we left at our hotel at 6, and we were in the next hotel that night at midnight.
Wow.
But most days we left around 9:30, and then we go to the start area. So we're there approximately 2.5 hours before the start. Then we do our previews. My colleagues do interviews with riders and DSs. And then I left with my colleague from French TV, who is also commentating from the moto. We go to a meeting point, because not the whole race is covered on TV. So the motos, they all go in the race, approximately half an hour before the coverage starts. So we go to that meeting point, and then I'll gear up for my few hours on the moto. So then, and then we start driving behind normally I choose to be behind the peloton, because then I see stuff like crashes, like mechanicals, like DSs talking to each other, riders going back to the cars, etc. So I see then things that you don't see on TV. And if there's a breakaway, I try to be behind the breakaway with my driver. and then they get me in the coverage a few times. I try to say something useful, and then just before the finish, normal depends on if it's a mountain or a flat stage. We drive off to the finish, so I'm there when the actual finish is there, and then we get some first reactions, some short analyze of the race, and then we do the mix zone. So then the winners, they all go through the mix zone. So that takes another 2 hours, I would say, 1.5, 2 hours, and then we go to our hotel. And then I try to watch the race back, or at least the finale, because of course I don't see a lot on the bike. So I try to watch it back, and then we eat and we sleep. Then the next day again.
Yeah. Are you doing multiple takes of, like the interviews before and after, or the, sort of the recaps?
No, we try to do it at once, but sometimes we need a few takes. But we try to do them all at once. Yeah.
Yeah. And, honestly, it seems to be just so cool to be on the moto behind the race or around the race. I mean, is it as cool as it seems?
Yeah, it is as cool as it seems. Yeah, I think you need to be a little bit like an adrenaline junkie, and I guess that's what I am. Because the faster, the more I enjoy it, especially the descents. It is really fun. The only thing that's sometimes a bit scary is like the chaos behind the peloton with the team cars, and they just pass you very closely sometimes, or if you have to pass the peloton and the riders don't really move. Those are the only times that I'm a bit like, oh, okay, I hope nobody crashes, or we don't crash. But also all the moto drivers I've been with so far, they're super experienced, and they're really good. So I'm pretty comfortable on the bike. Yeah.
The descending was crazy this year. It's so fast.
Yeah, it was super fast. Yeah.
Oh my
yeah.
gosh. Faster than I've ever seen the women's peloton go. It was amazing.
Yeah, but it's also they train more in the mountains. They prepare these stages. They have better material. So they're also much more prepared, and then they also have higher speed. Yeah.
That's one thing that has changed a lot. Like sometimes we think, or I think it's easy to think, okay, there's more money in the sport, so the riders get a bigger salary. But there's all this other stuff that happens when more money goes into the sport, like the prep that you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. No, they're reckoning stages. They're having altitude camps. They're preparing as teams for on altitude for races like this. So that is very different than it was like even 5 years ago.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that I think it was on your coverage that it was mentioned that Kassia's team had reconned that corner where the crash was, and so they all knew to be way up front because they had done the prep.
Yeah, well, it was, and that's also something that's still pretty new in women's cycling, is that they have two team cars in the race, most teams at least. So you have a team car before the peloton and one behind. So in case there is a breakaway group, then the second team car that's in front of the peloton can easily go behind that breakaway, and the second team car can stay behind the bunch. So you always have your riders covered in the bunch and in the breakaway. And if there is not a breakaway, that second team car is in front of the race, so it can also spot difficulties in the course, or it can stop and hand out some bottles, or it's just super handy to have that. And actually the Canyon SRAM team car was in front of the race, and they reckoned that they went through that corner, and they let the riders know, like, be aware there's a really tricky corner coming up. So I don't think they actually reckoned it like before, but they reckoned it like earlier in that stage.
I love that they noticed it. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on today is to ask you about where you stand on the current length of the women's Tour de France.
I think it could be a little bit longer. I think at least 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. I think 10 days is a really great length actually for like a Grand Tour, because you don't need to have a rest day for 10 days, so you can race 10 days in a row, but it's still a little bit longer than a week, so you can have like 2 full weekends. So I think that would already be a big improvement for the tour. 10 days used to be like the Giro, for example. But 2 weeks also would be great. For me, it's not necessary to be longer than 2 weeks, because I think 3 weeks is really long.
It's long as a spectator, I got to tell you.
Yes, but yeah, like for example, this year I worked at the men's Giro for 3 weeks, and I thought it was also really long, because I feel also a bit like you can make it longer, but I don't really see why you would do that, because you will get that really boring stages in, and you need to have these rest days. So I don't think it makes the racing more exciting. I think one thing that always has been really fun about women's cycling is that the stages are pretty short, that the races are not super long, and therefore it becomes it has that kind of it's a little bit more unpredictable. And I don't really see why you want to like copy that whole men's model into women's cycling, because you actually make it just as boring as men's cycling.
There is something that happens in that sort of just like I can endure the 3 weeks, which I find a little bit interesting.
But I don't really know why we should prove that we can endure those 3 weeks. Like, who cares, really?
Well, I'm definitely of the camp that it should be longer. A week to me is it.
But do you think it should be 3 weeks?
No, I think 2 weeks would. I think right now my goal would be 2 weeks. I think, I would be interested to see what happens then. Do you think we're ready for 2 weeks? Like, could we do that tomorrow or next year?
I think 2 weeks would definitely be possible. Yeah. Especially if you see now how fast teams are developing. But again, you also have to look at the whole race calendar, and if there's space, and what's the impact on other races that are on the calendar right now. I think we need to look at that, but I think 2 weeks is definitely possible. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about this survey, which is related. The recent survey from Cyclist Alliance came out and talked about the salaries, I guess the salary differential between the top tier people like Demi, who is rumored to, be getting $1 million, versus riders on the Continental team who, I think you said 27% of non-World Tour riders still receive no salary or income, and 55% of riders earning less than $10,000 a year.
Yeah, that's
correct. Rough.
Yeah, that's something that I think, like, really in general, you can say, okay, in the World Tour, the salaries are only increasing, and they become higher and higher. So we have that, like, because there is the minimum salary, that becomes kind of a automatic thing, that there is this I don't know the English word, but I guess you have that internal competition within World Tour riders, so the salary rises. But that's not there in continental teams. And you also see, like I said earlier, because all the focus is on World Tour, continental teams are getting it's harder and harder for them to also get the sponsorship in, because they're not able anymore to ride the big races. Their calendar is getting smaller. So it's for sponsors less interesting to invest in continental teams, and that has an impact on rider salaries in those teams, but also on all the other things, because we've seen, I think, 3 teams disappearing in the last few months on continental level, purely on financial reasons. So that gap is only increasing.
Are there sponsors that are interested in, bigger teams that would come on board if rules were changed that made it more attractive to them?
Well, you see, for example, that there are a few smaller teams that are investing more to be able to race the Tour de France. Like we had some continental teams that stepped up to World Tour level purely so the team could ride the Tour de France Femmes. So that's, I think, a positive development of having such a big race. But it is a really big step that you have to take as a sponsor or as a team to get from Continental to World Tour. And then the second thing is not only the financial gap, but it's also, do you have the level of riders to have a World Tour team? Like, there's been a lot of talk about that Tashkent team in the Tour, that is a Continental team. And a World Tour team there, Roland, that also finished with only 2 riders, I think, the Tour de France Femmes. So that's, with all respect, a good example of a World Tour team that has the funding to pay their riders, but the riders don't have the level to race on a World Tour level. So we all can want to, we can say, oh, you all need to be World Tour, so you have the finance, etc. But we currently don't have the amount of riders yet to have more World Tour riders. Like, okay, maybe I should say it in this way. If we look to the whole women peloton out there, Continental and World Tour, there are not enough high-level riders for more World Tour teams. So we can increase the World Tour teams, but there are not riders to race on that level. That's why we need to focus on Continental, because that's where riders come into the sport. That's where they can develop into that World Tour level rider.
So what would you like to see implemented for those Continental teams that you think that would make a huge difference on those teams, but also to develop the riders?
Well, I think one thing that will be implemented next year, and that's a really good step, is the introduction of pro teams. So pro teams will be in between World Tour and Continental. They will have a minimum salary, and they will have to register through the UCI. And that's a big difference, because Continental teams have to register through national federations, and national federations have different levels of how a team is monitored on, if they have the finances, if they have the structure, etc., to run a team. So the Pro Conti tier will be a good in-between step to make sure that riders that are like on the top end of Conti level, riders and teams, but they don't yet have the finances or the level of riders to make it into the World Tour, they will have a good place in that pro team category, and they will be able to race World Tour races, but they will also be able to race lower level races. So I think this is a good in-between step. And for Continental level itself, I think there needs to be more oversight on what's exactly happening in these teams, and make sure that the regulations are a little bit higher. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a minimum salary, but there needs to be more oversight on the fact that it's a safe space to work for riders. So they have a race program, they have equipment, they have a training program. They don't have to pay for their own expenses when it comes to racing and training, etc. So that they have sufficient insurance, so that really the basis is covered. I think that's really important. And then the race calendar needs to be there. So there needs to be focus on like a more balanced calendar, because all the races that are well organized now want to be World Tour, because then they know they get the big riders. But there needs to be an incentive for race organizers to also organize races 0.1 or 0.2, that's interesting for so Continental teams can race there, and riders can learn to race for the win, and they're not just thrown into the Tour de France trying to make it to the finish, but they're actually learn to race, learn to ride finals, which is way better for the development, but also way more enjoyable. And I think it would be great if we get like a U23 series, so there is is more opportunity specifically for that age group.
Learning to race for the win is so different than hanging on the back for dear life. I
Yeah.
mean, it's just like such a different mentality, and you can easily just, I don't know, get into really bad habits of hanging on.
Exactly. Yeah.
So do you think there are teams that are ready and anxious to sign up for this pro category?
Yeah, I understand there's a lot of teams actually
Oh,
that
good,
want
good.
to sign up for it. So that's great news. Yeah.
hmm And you mentioned riders feeling unsafe, or that they should feel safe. And in this survey, it said that nearly 1 in 5 riders feel unsafe on their team. Like, what does that mean?
Well, it means that, for example, they are forced to race with injuries or sickness. There is abuse of power within the team. They are sometimes forced to stay in a team house that they don't want to be in. They they need to race more than they're able to. They don't have sufficient team staff, or they feel unsafe around team staff. It's a quite a big spectrum.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah.
One of the things that you didn't mention yet is the length of contracts. It
Yeah.
seems like having a 1-year contract is not the way to go. I mean, there's just so many problems that happen when you're looking for a new contract every single year, and the whole peloton is looking for a
Yeah.
new contract every year.
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, professional sports is a very unpredictable career
Sure.
choice. But yeah, the short contracts is definitely a tricky one, because yeah, you want to have that security. On the other hand, we also see, especially with continental teams, that yeah, you can have a 3-year contract, but if your team suddenly disappears because it's not able to finance the end until the end of the year, then you're also without a team. So in general, these contracts are very, it's quite an insecure job. Yeah, I think that is definitely something that hopefully improves in the future, that we have riders with longer contracts. And I also need to say that most of these things we still see happening on continental level. So that's something that we've been able to extract a bit better in this survey, like compared to previous years, that we extracted issues for continental and world tour, for example. So that's quite interesting.
Well, you may have covered it already, but what are your current priorities as the president of the Cyclist Alliance?
Yeah, so we're really focused on this continental level and issues in that end of the sport. So really focused on the development, trying to make sure that there are better regulations in place for continental riders, continental teams. That's one thing. Race safety is something that we're always super focused on. So if that's either, or I should say, safety in general. So it's ethics, but it's also race safety. So these are two things that are on top of our agenda. We have been very very focused on visibility, and it's great that there is so much improvement in on that side. So that's something that we're really happy about. But I would say, yeah, that the safety aspect, the continental, so the development aspect, U23, that is something that we're pushing for still a lot. And I think also, or I know also, what we would really try to see is to be able to make more agreements directly with teams, because there is still so many things that are decided without the riders or the teams involved. Like currently we have these discussions about radios, for example, in the race, which are very important for the safety. And they're just, we see that, in my opinion, the UCI is very influenced by media. So they try to quickly make changes because there is a lot of like talking from fans or media about like, oh, racing will be more interesting without radios, or oh, this helmet is so ugly, it should not be in cycling, and all these things are
Oh,
so
man.
influenced by what what other people say instead of there is no long-term vision for the riders, for the teams, etc. So I think that for us it's really important to keep focused on our priorities, our agenda, and be able to work on that more together with the teams, because the riders and the teams are the most important stakeholder of the sport. If we give the UCI the idea that they have the superpower here, then they will also make the decisions. But in my opinion, they don't. They are just our governing body. And I think it should be the riders, the teams, and the race organizers that have the most important voice.
It sounds like the Cyclist Alliance has a like a good working relationship with everybody now. I remember when we first talked and there was a lot of headbutting.
There still is, to be
I'm
honest.
sure. Well, I'm sure. Well,
Yeah.
yes.
No, there still is, and that's also kind of it's a challenge, and in some way it's also quite fun actually, because you're trying to change the sport, and you will not do that by just being super friendly with everybody. So I personally don't mind a bit of headbutting at all. But no, I think what you do see is with the sport becoming more mature, that also teams understand that, and that's not for all teams, but definitely there's a few good teams out there that understand we need to work on this together, and it's not just, we shouldn't all think about our own agenda or about having money to be able to run a team next year, but we have to look for the longer term vision. And I think for the Cyclist Alliance, it's definitely helped that we also matured as a organization, and we have team staff that is able to build like a good working relationship with the UCI, with teams, and they can do like the nice talk, and I can do the headbutting, and it's okay if they don't like me, but at least we have some good people working for the organization that are a bit more political maybe than me.
Yeah. Well, I like that you're a headbutter. I mean, that's always important to get stuff done, as you said.
True.
Yeah. Well, do you want to leave us with anything, or did we cover everything? What are you up to next?
So I am. So the rest of the year, I'm just commentating from behind my desk on the races that are left. But we still have quite some good races left for the rest of the season. So that's really cool. And no, I would say, like, tune in and watch women's cycling if you haven't done it so far. There is still a few really good races to watch this season, like the World Championships, for example. And if people want to support our work at the Cyclist Alliance, they can do that. They can become like a donor or a supporter, or just go to our website, and you'll find all that information. And that's super helpful, because that's how we are funded still.
Well, great. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure as always. Yeah.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you, Iris Slappendel, for keeping us up to date on women's cycling and talking all about Le Tour de France Femmes avec Zwift. Find all sorts of links in the show notes at hearhersports.com, including a Stage 5 race analysis video, links to riders Iris mentioned, history of the women's tour, and ways to find out more about the Cyclist Alliance and Iris Apparel. Thank you for listening. There are several ways you can help us to continue making the show one of the few to focus on female athletes in a way that allows them the time and space offered by long-form interviews. One is to tell your friends. All podcasts say this, of course, but it does really matter, because personal recommendations are how most people find podcasts. Two, make a donation. Even a few dollars helps us with production costs. It's not cheap to create a podcast, so we appreciate every single donation. Go to donate page at hearhersports.com to donate directly, or to the support tab to find links to our Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and affiliate programs. And the last way to support the show is simply to keep listening. Make sure you catch every single episode. Thank you so much. Until next time, bye-bye.
Women's Running Stories, where we explore the intersection between running and life. Because every woman who is committed to a running journey has a story to tell, and this is where you'll find those stories. I am host and producer Cherie Louise Turner. I'm a 53-year-old runner, and together with original music by musician and runner Cormac O'Regan, we bring these inspirational stories to life. Please join us to fuel your adventures.